Hi, this is John Cutler. I've gotten a lot of questions about this post, and I refer to it often. So I thought it might be interesting to kind of give a video walkthrough of the post. It's kind of new for me, but we'll see what happens. So the post is called Forms and Shadows, and the basic idea is that there's no one right way to view companies or work or anything. I mean, you can view things in terms of work or people or the org structure or money or goals or strategy, any of these things, activities, behaviors, knowledge. The list goes on. I mean, you could probably add another 15 things to those things. The basic idea here is that when you have a reasonable structure for your company and the incentives are in place and people have access to customers and they've got goals. When things are pretty coherent, like in this Team A example here, you get something like this picture on the left, right, where all of those frames overlap each other. And so if I said something like, "Oh, hey, that's the uh, growth team or that's the onboarding team," you wouldn't need to kind of guess what their goals were. You wouldn't need to guess what their strategy was. You'd have a reasonable sense of what that team did and how they were operating. You'd sort of know. And on the right, imagine a situation where the teams aren't really coherent with the customers they're serving. The org chart is kind of maybe set up for an old strategy. Maybe the architecture isn't really coherent with the problems they need to solve. And so what you get in this case is you get this, these things are separated. Now, the important point here is that Team A, from a process perspective or workflow perspective or narrative perspective or communication perspective, doesn't need to go into every question and say, "Oh, well, we're budgeting what we're doing like projects, but we're trying to operate like this team. And guess what? We've got 10 different dependencies." They have so much lower cognitive load in a sense. Team B, on the other hand, it gets into this. You'll hear people in that company say, "Well, we need to connect the dots. We need to connect the dots for that particular team." And what that means is you've got all these different frames or viewing these things, and to make sense of things, you need to kind of connect them together, right? You need to map everything together. On the left, you don't really need to do a lot of mapping. So when you see a rapid scale up tech company that still has one product and has a reasonably coherent org chart, people don't go into every meeting and say, "Oh, could you map what you're doing to the 55 different company goals?" Or, "Oh, hey, there's 8 teams involved. What's the budget for this team or that team?" It's just pretty coherent. You don't need to expend all that extra energy. But if things have drifted like on the right, then you end up expending that energy. And so what I do in this post is some people have asked some questions about this particular image, but the idea on the left is you have this team. You've got some value drivers. The teams can generally focus their work on that. And the whole point here is, these are the teams, the team on the left that can literally walk into a meeting and say, "Yeah, this is my annual roadmap." And it takes like 5 seconds to understand what it is. It's like, "Oh, okay, you're moving that driver, that driver, that driver. Got it. This like links to the company strategy this way. Amazing. Thank you so much." Now on the right, you have this team that, you can see that this work is spanning over the teams. Multiple teams are trying to influence multiple different value drivers. Uh, and this picture isn't great, but the whole idea with this picture is that, if you walk into a meeting with this team and say, "How's it going?" They might say, "Well, I can't really tell you how it's going because there's another team working on this with us and they're really busy. And, they've given us 9% time," or some dumb stuff like that. And so we don't know. And so the whole idea is the thing on the right. Now, the point isn't, however, that this is inherently bad. It's just that it's going to require more sort of overhead and thinking. When we talk about complexity, this is really important because, product work is inherently complex. So from that perspective, all the complexity is kind of bounded nicely with Team A. With Team B working through all these things, they might find themselves as battling complexity. Team A doesn't think one way or another about whether it's complex or not. Things just seem kind of straightforward and they do their work. It would be like being in a band and recording in a nice recording studio that you own, that you have all your equipment there. Team B is kind of like, oh, well, we have to jump around, go to different recording studios. We have session musicians. We're battling different bits of equipment and stuff. I've been in both of these situations, and it feels very different. The point here is that, well, first is you never have coherence is always evolving. So if you have a rapid scale up company and, let's say that they tried a multi-product strategy for many years, and now they're trying to make the pendulum swing back to a different type of more, packaged platform offering maybe for what they're doing, that coherence is going to drift apart. This is not a static thing that coherence exists. And the question then is like, how do you fix this, or how do companies fix it? And I think what's interesting with this is, there's really a couple options. So when I hear people talk about SAFe, for example, it really reminds me of what's on the left, which is just sort of institutionalized incoherence. Like, this is really hard. We're going to need to put project managers and program managers and all this kind of ritual and process because none of these frames really overlap nicely. That is one way. Now, in the middle, you sort of have this idea that, like, well, we have to attract this to something more coherent. That could be a new strategy. That could be an architecture. It could be a new way of kind of looking at the work. It could be maybe a successful experiment a team is running. And on the right, instead of, you sort of have that incoherence and you try to attract it away, something. The idea in the middle is there's sort of temporary scaffolding. So you do a little bit of the stuff on the left, but you do it just enough to get a bit of coherence so that you can think about what you're doing, and then you nudge it to a different direction. And so what's the whole point of this particular post is that, just kind of summarizing here, a lot of people get really enamored by the idea that they just need to link everything together and then suddenly everything's going to make sense. If you could just get all of these frames mapped together, if you could just add enough rows to every single table, if you could just all speak the same language, if you could all use the exact same right template and format, you would solve the problems. And this post basically says, well, no, not really, right? If you're doing all that, imagining that you're going to do this thing on the right and that's going to work, you're sort of deluding yourself. You do need to create these pockets of coherence. Now, this doesn't mean you don't need operations occasionally to sort of take stuff from one context and help people in another context understand what they're doing, or maybe automate things that should be automated, or maybe consider how to get people to collaborate when they should be collaborating. There's sort of a middle ground, right? You're not always going to be on the right here. You're not always going to be on the left. So obviously, there's not a utopia on the left, and it's not all bad on the right. But the general idea is that, if you walk into situations, someone gave me a great quote today. They said, the goal is not to connect all the dots. It's for the right people to see the dots that they need to see. No one can actually connect all the dots in a company. 95% of people don't want to sit in front of a Miro board with 1,000 stickies in it. They want to come to work. They want to do what they need to do. And so it's the responsibility then of operations folks and leaders and other people to not connect the dots, but basically let people see the dots that are going to be useful to them in the context they need to see them. So hopefully that was interesting.